Jasmine Carter was running late. Her car hummed softly as she maneuvered through the quiet streets of the small town, where she had taken a detour to avoid traffic on the highway. The morning had been a blur of phone calls, emails, and final preparations for a crucial meeting in the city. She glanced at the clock and sighed. She had to be on time if she wanted to impress the board of directors. But even as she sped up, her thoughts were preoccupied with the work ahead. Her mind raced with strategies and possible questions that might arise during the meeting. She had earned her reputation as a formidable civil rights attorney, but today's meeting was something bigger. It was a potential partnership that could propel her work to new heights, bringing attention to issues of racial inequality and social justice on a national scale. The opportunity to further her cause in such a significant way was within reach, but the universe had other plans. As she drove down the road, a sudden flash of red and blue lights cut through her focus. Jasmine immediately stiffened. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. She had seen the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, and she knew exactly what was coming. A quick glance at the rearview mirror confirmed that the car behind her was a police vehicle. Though she was in a hurry, she remained calm. She had dealt with officers before and never let her emotions get the best of her. She pulled over to the side of the road and put her car in park. As she waited for the officer to approach her window, her thoughts raced, trying to figure out what she had possibly done wrong. Had she been speeding? Was her taillight out? Or maybe her registration had expired? She took a deep breath and rolled down the window, hoping to resolve the situation quickly and without hassle. The officer who approached her car wasn't just any officer. He was a man she didn't expect to see today. Judge Thomas Caldwell, an older white man wearing the unmistakable robes of his office. He was a respected judge in the town, known for his stern demeanor and strict adherence to the law. Jasmine had heard of him before, but never in this context. She had never imagined she would be face to face with him in such a mundane situation. "Good morning, Judge," Jasmine said in a polite but neutral tone, wondering if the familiarity of his title would shift the interaction in her favor. Judge Caldwell looked down at her with an impassive face. His voice was clipped as he spoke. "You were speeding, ma'am," he said. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to issue a fine for this violation." Jasmine frowned for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She was certain she hadn't been speeding, but she kept her thoughts to herself. "You're mistaken, Judge. I was keeping a safe pace," she said, "but I'm in a bit of a rush today. If we could resolve this quickly, I'd appreciate it." Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "You were still speeding, ma'am, and that's what I'm issuing a fine for." His tone left little room for negotiation. Jasmine's heart sank. She couldn't afford this fine, especially not with her meeting looming so close. She tried to keep her composure and responded calmly, "I understand. I'll take care of it immediately. But is there any way to avoid the penalty?" Judge Caldwell shook his head, his face unyielding. "I'm afraid not, ma'am," he replied, handing her the ticket. Jasmine nodded resignedly, taking the fine from him, feeling a sense of frustration and helplessness that she tried not to show. But her day was about to take an unexpected turn, a turn that would change everything. She had no idea that this seemingly insignificant encounter would set the stage for a much bigger and more complex journey. Later that afternoon, Jasmine was still reeling from the encounter with Judge Caldwell. Her fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel as she drove toward the city, the fine sitting uncomfortably in her bag. She tried to push the frustration aside, focusing instead on the meeting ahead, but the weight of the ticket seemed to hang over her thoughts. She couldn't shake the sense of injustice, the feeling that she had been treated unfairly, but there was no time for that now. Not when a potential partnership with the national nonprofit was on the line. As she arrived at her destination, her phone buzzed with a new message. The screen lit up with a text from her assistant. "Call me as soon as you can. It's urgent." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. Her assistant rarely contacted her with anything that couldn't wait, and the urgency in the message set her on edge. She excused herself from the meeting to step outside, her phone pressed to her ear. "Jasmine, you won't believe this," her assistant's voice crackled through the line. "You've just been nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court." Jasmine froze. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. The words echoed in her mind as she struggled to process what she had just heard. The Supreme Court. Her. She had worked for years to bring justice to the people who needed it most, but the thought of being nominated to the highest court in the land was something she had never dared to dream. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This is real." "Absolutely," her assistant confirmed. "The president just made the announcement. Your name is on the list." Jasmine couldn't contain the rush of emotion that flooded her. This was everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. But amid the excitement, there was a nagging thought that lingered at the back of her mind. The traffic stop. The fine. The judge. Her breath caught in her throat. How would this affect her nomination? Would people judge her based on a simple mistake, one she hadn't even had a chance to explain? "Jasmine, are you okay?" her assistant asked, sensing her silence. "Yeah," she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. "I'm fine. It's a lot to process." As the conversation ended, Jasmine found herself staring out the window, watching the world move by as if it had no idea that her life had just changed in the most profound way. She had always known her work would be important, but this nomination, this recognition, was something entirely different. It was the culmination of years of relentless dedication, of fighting for the rights of those who had been overlooked and marginalized. Yet there was still the small matter of the fine. As much as she tried to focus on the excitement of the moment, her thoughts kept returning to that encounter. What if it became a scandal? What if people questioned her integrity because of a simple traffic violation? Would Judge Caldwell's actions, which now seemed so trivial, come back to haunt her? Shaking her head, Jasmine forced herself to focus. She had worked too hard for too long to let one incident derail everything she had fought for. She wasn't going to let a minor setback define her. After all, she had been fighting for justice long before anyone had even considered her for the court. The fine was just a small chapter in a much larger story, a story she was still writing. As the days passed, the news of Jasmine Carter's Supreme Court nomination spread like wildfire. Media outlets scrambled to cover every angle of her life, from her legal career to her personal journey. They interviewed colleagues, dug into her past, and even reached out to her old professors. But amidst all the praise and excitement, one particular event began to dominate the headlines: the traffic fine. At first, it seemed like a trivial detail, but as more and more reporters dug into it, they discovered that Jasmine had been issued a fine by Judge Thomas Caldwell a respected but somewhat controversial figure in the small town. The story gained traction, fueled by the irony of the incident. Here was a woman who was being nominated for the highest court in the land, but her first interaction with a figure of the judiciary was one of unfairness, at least in the eyes of many who were now examining the situation. The media quickly began to frame the encounter as something far larger than just a minor traffic violation. Was it indicative of a larger issue? Had Judge Caldwell's actions been influenced by racial bias? And most importantly, was this fine an example of the kind of systemic injustice Jasmine had spent her career fighting against? The questions lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Social media erupted with opinions. Some took to Twitter to express their anger, condemning Judge Caldwell's behavior. A black woman, one of the most brilliant legal minds of her generation, treated like a criminal for a traffic ticket. Unbelievable, one tweet read. Others, however, were more skeptical. A fine is a fine. She should have just paid it and moved on. Why bring it up now? Read another comment. Jasmine had been prepared for scrutiny. She had built a career out of standing up to critics and tackling uncomfortable truths. But she hadn't anticipated that something so seemingly insignificant would become a focal point of her confirmation. She couldn't help but wonder if her life would always be reduced to moments like this: a traffic stop, a fine, a small interaction blown up into something far bigger than it ever needed to be. At first, Jasmine tried to ignore the noise, focusing on her nomination process. Her interviews with senators were professional, her speeches eloquent, but the whispers about the fine continued to swirl in the background. She found herself on the defensive more than she ever anticipated. Every time she sat down for an interview, reporters would ask her about it, as though her entire career hinged on that one moment with Judge Caldwell. Her team advised her to keep her responses short, to not let the fine derail the momentum of her nomination. But Jasmine knew she couldn't just brush it off. This wasn't just about a minor ticket. It was about the principles she had fought for her entire career. Equality, fairness, the idea that everyone, no matter their race or background, should be treated with dignity. The incident had become a symbol, and if she ignored it, she feared the implications would be even worse. In a press conference, she finally addressed it head-on. She spoke calmly, explaining the situation as it had happened, but more importantly, she used the opportunity to talk about systemic inequalities in the justice system. "Yes, I received a fine," Jasmine said, her voice steady, "and I'll pay it just like anyone else would. But what I also want people to understand is that this is part of a much bigger conversation about the way we, as a society, view and treat people of color, especially women." The room was silent for a moment before a reporter asked, "Do you believe that Judge Caldwell acted unfairly because of your race?" Jasmine's gaze was steady, her answer thoughtful. "I can't speak to Judge Caldwell's motivations. But what I do know is that these kinds of things happen every day. Minor infractions that turn into obstacles for those who are already disadvantaged. We can't pretend that bias doesn't exist in all corners of our society, including our judicial system." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, the conversation shifted. People weren't just talking about the fine anymore. They were talking about the deeper issues she had raised. Jasmine knew it wasn't going to be easy, but if she could shift the dialogue, even a little, then maybe this entire situation wouldn't be for nothing. She had come to realize that while the fine had been an unfortunate event, it could also be a powerful platform to bring attention to the very issues she had dedicated her life to addressing. And with that realization, Jasmine felt more empowered than ever to continue her journey toward the Supreme Court. Judge Thomas Caldwell sat in his office, staring at the framed photo of his family on the desk. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he thought about the traffic stop with Jasmine Carter, he felt an unease gnawing at him. It wasn't just that the interaction had become a point of public interest. It was that he knew, deep down, he hadn't treated her the way he should have. As a judge, he had spent his career trying to be impartial, trying to ensure that justice was served fairly. But had he really done that in this instance? He leaned back in his chair and replayed the scene in his mind. Jasmine had been calm, polite, and respectful. She had not raised her voice, not even when he issued the fine without much explanation. She hadn't protested, hadn't tried to argue her way out of it. She'd accepted the ticket with quiet grace, a trait he later realized spoke volumes about who she was. Yet he had treated her like just another person who had broken the law, without taking a moment to understand who she was or what she represented. He had issued the fine without even considering that Jasmine might be someone important, someone who was about to change the very fabric of the nation's judicial system. But even more troubling was the realization that he hadn't considered how her race might have influenced his actions. He had prided himself on being above such things. He'd have always believed he didn't judge people based on their appearance or background. Yet, in hindsight, there was a part of him that couldn't help but wonder. Did he subconsciously give her a harsher treatment because of who she was? Judge Caldwell tried to push the thought away, telling himself it was impossible, that it wasn't possible to allow such biases to affect his judgment. He had been trained to be better than that. But still, the doubt lingered, and as the days passed, it only grew stronger. He started to read more about Jasmine, her work in civil rights, her rise as a legal scholar, her contributions to the fight for equality. The more he learned about her, the more he began to feel ashamed of how he had treated her. Jasmine wasn't just any woman. She was a trailblazer, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. And yet, in his eyes, she had simply been another driver speeding through town. He couldn't let it go. Not now, with the media attention on her Supreme Court nomination, and certainly not with the public scrutiny of his actions. He realized that he needed to do something about it. But what could he do? Could an apology really make up for what had happened? Could he repair the damage he had unknowingly caused? After days of agonizing over it, Judge Caldwell made a decision. He would take the first step to make things right. He would publicly apologize to Jasmine Carter. It wouldn't undo the past, but it might help shift the conversation, and more importantly, it would allow him to stand by the principles of justice that he had spent his career upholding. He drafted a statement, unsure of how it would be received. It wasn't just about admitting he was wrong. It was about showing that he understood the deeper issues at play, issues that went beyond a simple traffic violation. He knew it would be a hard conversation to have, but if he was truly committed to fairness, he needed to own up to his mistakes. As he pressed send on the statement, Judge Caldwell knew this was just the beginning. The fallout from this incident could follow him for years to come, but at least he could look in the mirror and know that he had taken responsibility for his actions, no matter how uncomfortable it was to face them. A few days after Judge Caldwell issued his public apology, the moment of reckoning arrived. Jasmine had been scheduled to speak at a civil rights conference in the city, an event she had been preparing for months. It was an important platform, a chance to address the issues she had dedicated her life to. But as she arrived at the venue, she saw him. Judge Thomas Caldwell ***. He was standing near the entrance of the conference hall, nervously adjusting his suit jacket. His eyes met hers, and there was a brief moment of hesitation before he took a step toward her. Jasmine's stomach tightened. She had no idea why he was here, but the sight of him triggered the same mix of frustration and confusion that had gnawed at her since the traffic stop. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice quieter than usual. "Miss Carter," he began, I owe you an apology." His words came slowly, almost haltingly. "I didn't handle the situation between us the way I should have. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment, and I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve." Jasmine stood there, her heart beating a little faster. She had heard his public apology, of course, but hearing it from him directly, in person, was something entirely different. She wasn't sure how to react. Part of her wanted to just walk away. It wasn't that she hadn't been hoping for an apology. It was the way it had all happened. The fine, the rush to issue it, the fact that it had become a media circus. None of it had felt fair, and his words, though genuine, didn't change that. But another part of her understood. She knew that facing the consequences of one's actions wasn't easy, especially for someone like Judge Caldwell, who had built his career on being infallible. For someone like him, admitting a mistake publicly was a rare and significant thing. "I appreciate your apology, Judge," she said, keeping her voice even. "But I can't pretend like this is just about a ticket. It's about something bigger than that. The way we're treated, the assumptions people make about us without knowing who we are. You didn't see me that day. You just saw someone you could penalize. I get it. It happens every day, especially to people who look like me." His face softened, the guilt clear in his eyes. "I know," he said quietly, "and that's why I'm here. I wanted to tell you that I've spent days thinking about it, reading about your work, about who you really are. I know now that I acted out of ignorance, and I regret it deeply." Jasmine studied him for a moment. She had fought for so long for the world to see people like her, not just as one-dimensional figures, but as multifaceted human beings with stories, with dignity. It was difficult to believe that the man standing in front of her had truly come to understand that, but his words seemed sincere. Still, her guardedness remained. She couldn't just forgive him because it was expected. "You don't get to decide how I'm treated," Jasmine continued, her voice steady. "None of us do. We don't get to decide who's worthy of respect and who's not. That's something that has to be understood, especially for someone in your position. A judge, someone who's supposed to uphold justice." He nodded, his expression somber. "I understand, and I want to make it right, not just for you, but for everyone who's been treated the way you have." Jasmine wasn't sure if he truly understood, but she saw the sincerity in his eyes. The conversation hung there for a moment, the weight of it settling over them both. Jasmine took a deep breath and nodded, more to herself than to him. "I appreciate that. But words are just words. It's what you do next that will matter." Before she could say more, she was interrupted by someone calling her name from inside the hall. Jasmine looked at the judge, feeling the tension ease just slightly. She gave him a small, measured smile, one that was not quite forgiveness, but not anger either. "I've got to go. Thank you for coming here, for taking responsibility." As she turned to walk away, she knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. But for the first time, she felt like there might be a glimmer of change. Not just in Judge Caldwell, but in the system he represented. It would take time, a lot of it. But the fact that he was willing to acknowledge his failure was a start. It was a small victory in a larger battle, and Jasmine was beginning to see it might lead somewhere. The weeks that followed Judge Caldwell's apology marked a turning point, not just for him, but for Jasmine as well. Her Supreme Court nomination had reached a new level of intensity. The media, once obsessed with her traffic fine, now focused on her qualifications, her vision for the country, and her thoughts on the future of the justice system. But Jasmine couldn't help but think about the conversation she'd had with the judge, about how something as small as a traffic violation had become a flashpoint for a much larger issue. She had been asked countless times about Judge Caldwell, about the apology, about the fine, and every time she answered thoughtfully, always returning to the same key points: bias, justice, and the ongoing struggle for equality. Despite the public attention, Jasmine continued to stay grounded in her mission. It wasn't just about her. It was about creating a system that truly worked for everyone, that didn't bend for the privileged few, that didn't penalize the vulnerable. One morning, just days before her confirmation hearing, Jasmine sat down for an interview with one of the most prominent news outlets in the country. It was supposed to be a discussion about her career, her plans for the court, and how she would navigate the partisan gridlock that had come to define the judicial nomination process. But inevitably, the conversation turned to Judge Caldwell. "Let's talk about the fine," the reporter said, leaning forward. "After the apology, do you feel that the incident has been resolved? Do you think that Judge Caldwell's actions were an isolated mistake or part of a larger issue within the justice system?" Jasmine took a deep breath. She had learned to navigate questions like these with care, to avoid turning every conversation into a battleground. But she also knew this moment. This interview could be an opportunity to drive home her point about systemic inequality. "I think it's important to acknowledge what happened," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. What Judge Caldwell did was not just a mistake. It was a moment of reflection for him, a moment where he realized that his assumptions about me, and by extension, many others, were flawed. It wasn't just a traffic ticket. It was about how people of color are often treated differently in the system, and that's something we have to confront head-on. The reporter nodded, waiting for her to continue. "Apologies, like the one he offered, are important," she said, her tone firm. "But actions speak louder than words. This isn't just about one judge or one fine. It's about the bigger picture. It's about how the system can and should work better for everyone, regardless of their background, their race, or their socioeconomic status." Jasmine paused for a moment, reflecting on her own journey. She had spent years fighting for the people who had been ignored by the system, the marginalized, the oppressed, those who had been silenced for far too long. She didn't want this to be just a conversation about her nomination or a fine that had been blown out of proportion. She wanted it to be about changing the system, making it fair for everyone. "Do I think Judge Caldwell learned something from this?" she continued. "I do. I think he's reflecting on the ways his actions, unintentional or not, contributed to a larger pattern of injustice. But that's just the beginning. We all have a role to play in ensuring that the system is not only fair, but just. And that starts with acknowledging that things need to change." The interviewer seemed satisfied, but Jasmine couldn't shake the thought that, for all the headlines, for all the interviews, the true work was still ahead of her. The confirmation hearing loomed large, and the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. There would be those who would try to use her background, her race, her past, to discredit her. But Jasmine was ready. She had spent years standing up against the forces that tried to tear people like her down, and this was no different. As she finished the interview and prepared to leave, she couldn't help but think back to that day with Judge Caldwell, to the small, seemingly inconsequential moment that had set all of this in motion. That fine had sparked something much bigger, something that could transform the conversation about justice in America. And as she stepped out of the building, her mind set on the work ahead. She felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her moment, and she would use it to continue the fight she had always believed in. The day of Jasmine Carter's confirmation hearing arrived, and with it, the weight of a momentous decision hung in the air. The Senate chamber was filled with reporters, politicians, and members of the public, all eager to witness the process that could determine whether the first Black woman nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court would be confirmed. It was an overwhelming experience, but Jasmine was resolute. This was not just about her, it was about the principles of justice, equity, and fairness that had defined her entire career. It was about proving that the system could change, that it could be better. As she stepped into the room, she felt the eyes of every senator, every journalist, every onlooker fixed upon her. For some, this was a historic moment, a step forward in the ongoing fight for racial justice. For others, it was another contentious political battle. But Jasmine wasn't here to engage in petty partisanship. She was here to represent those who had never been represented in such a powerful arena. Senator Marlowe, one of the senior members of the Judiciary Committee, opened the session. "Welcome, Judge Carter," he said, his voice steady. "We are here today to assess your qualifications for the highest court in the land. Let me begin by asking about your views on the role of the Supreme Court in shaping the nation's policies, particularly in relation to issues of racial inequality." Jasmine took a deep breath, her hands steady as she adjusted the papers in front of her. She had prepared for this moment for years, but even so, the weight of the question was heavy. She knew this wasn't just about answering it. It was about making her case for why she should be there, why she belonged in the room with those who had come before her and those who would come after her. "The role of the Supreme Court," she began, her voice strong, "is to uphold the Constitution, to ensure that justice is applied fairly and equally to all people. But we also know that the Constitution was written at a time when many of us were not considered equal. For those who have been excluded from full participation in society, people of color, women, the disenfranchised, the court must be a beacon of hope, a place where justice is not just theoretical, but real. It is the court's duty to address the injustices that still persist today, to ensure that every citizen, regardless of their background, has the same opportunity to be heard and treated with dignity." The room was silent as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of her experience, her passion, and her unshakable belief in justice. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she refused to falter. This was her moment to prove that the system could be reformed, that it could truly serve the people it was meant to protect. Senator Rodriguez, another member of the committee, leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Jasmine. "Judge Carter," she began, "we are all aware of the incident with Judge Caldwell and the fine you received. It has been widely discussed in the media, and some have questioned whether this event is indicative of your ability to handle the pressures of a position on the Supreme Court. How do you respond to that?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. She had known this question would come, and she had prepared for it. "I have addressed that issue publicly before, and I will say it again. I received a fine, and I paid it. What happened with Judge Caldwell was a moment of misjudgment, not of who I am or what I stand for. That event sparked a larger conversation about bias in the justice system, and that conversation needs to continue. But I don't let one moment define my entire career, just as I don't let one bad decision by one person define the system as a whole. I've spent my life working to ensure that people like me are treated fairly, and that's the work I will continue to do as a justice of the Supreme Court." Her answer was direct, confident, and grounded in the same values she had always fought for. She wasn't about to let a single misstep define her. The room seemed to absorb her words, and for a moment, the tension eased. Jasmine knew there would be more questions, more challenges ahead, but this was the first test, and she had passed it. As the hearing continued, she spoke with clarity and conviction, discussing everything from criminal justice reform to her views on civil rights, from voting equality to the rights of marginalized communities. Each answer reinforced her belief that the law should serve everyone equally, that it should be a tool for progress and equity, not for perpetuating the systems of power that had historically oppressed so many. By the end of the day, Jasmine had not only made a powerful case for her confirmation, she had made a powerful statement about the future of the court. And as she walked out of the room, she felt the weight of history at her back. This wasn't just about her appointment. It was about changing the system, about ensuring that it could reflect the diverse, vibrant nation it was meant to serve. The fight wasn't over, but Jasmine was ready to continue it from the highest seat in the land. The days following Jasmine Carter's confirmation hearing were filled with both anticipation and reflection. As the Senate continued deliberations, the political world buzzed with opinions, debates, and, of course, scrutiny. But for Jasmine, the work was just beginning. Though she had proven her qualifications and her unwavering commitment to justice in front of the committee, she knew the real battle lay ahead, within the system itself. Being confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court was a monumental step, but what followed was even more critical, making the court a place of true equality and fairness. The confirmation vote came just a week later. It wasn't without controversy, but Jasmine's strength and grace under pressure had won over many skeptics. She had been prepared for the political games, for the partisan division, and for the inevitable criticisms. But in the end, it was clear that her appointment had become a symbol of hope, of change. The final vote was overwhelmingly in her favor, and Jasmine Carter became the first Black woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. As she stood before the cameras after the announcement, surrounded by her family and supporters, Jasmine allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every voice that had been silenced by a system that had long overlooked them. It was a testament to all the work that had gone into this moment, the years of hard-fought battles, the sacrifices, the unrelenting belief that things could be better. But as the media frenzy intensified, Jasmine found herself reflecting more on the personal journey that had led her here. She thought about Judge Caldwell and the fine he had issued, how that moment had sparked so much more than a simple public apology. It had opened up a dialogue about systemic inequality, about the biases that ran deep within the very institutions that were supposed to serve and protect. Though the incident had been uncomfortable for both of them, Jasmine realized that it had led to a necessary reckoning. She had fought for so long for others to be seen and heard, and now, as a member of the highest court in the land, she would have the platform to amplify those voices. In the first few weeks of her tenure on the court, Jasmine made it clear that she was not going to be another figurehead, another quiet presence in the chambers. She was going to challenge the status quo. Her decisions, though carefully weighed, reflected a commitment to fairness and justice that was not always popular but was always right. She advocated for more transparency, for the inclusion of diverse perspectives, and for the legal system to reckon with its own history of injustice. She made it her mission to ensure that the court wasn't just an institution of law, but an institution of progress. The media continued to follow her every move, but it was the subtle shifts in the legal world that mattered most. Jasmine was having a quiet yet profound impact on how cases were being argued, how laws were being interpreted. The biases that once permeated the system were not easily erased, but with each ruling, Jasmine chipped away at the barriers that had long stood in the way of real justice. Months passed, and the nation began to see the full impact of her presence on the court. Her groundbreaking decisions became a hallmark of her career, advocating for the marginalized, for those whose voices had often been drowned out in the halls of power. Slowly but surely, the court started to evolve, becoming a more inclusive institution. Her commitment to fairness, transparency, and equality had redefined what it meant to be a judge in America. And while the road ahead would never be easy, Jasmine knew one thing for sure: the fight for justice was a long one. But she had been given the opportunity to help shape it, and that was a responsibility she would carry with her every day. As she looked back at the journey that had brought her to this moment, the fine, the apology, the confirmation, Jasmine felt a deep sense of gratitude. This wasn't just her victory. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the nation, one in which justice would be truly blind and fairness would no longer be an aspiration, but a reality. In the end, Jasmine Carter's legacy would not be defined by her status as the first Black woman to serve on the Supreme Court. It would be defined by the lives she touched, the injustices she righted, and the example she set for future generations. The road had been long, but Jasmine knew that she had just begun to pave the way for others to follow.